Hi, I'm Jackson-Jolley. I'm here with Dr. Etienne, who is an associate professor of neurology and medicine, as well as vice chancellor of diversity and inclusion for New York Medical College in New York. He is also a Forbes contributor, where he writes on his expertise of neurology and public health. Welcome, Dr. Etienne.
Thanks, Ali, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you because I recently read a piece you wrote about how childhood experiences can impact brain development. And in fact, in that piece, you call traumatic childhood experiences invisible scars. Can you explain that to us? Like, what do you mean by that, and what are the implications?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. So basically, I'll start off by just talking about, scars that are more obvious. If somebody has a scar on their face, you might see the scar on their face and you might ask, hey, what happened to you? How did you get that? Or if they injure their ankle, you see them walking around, trouble walking, can't get around. You might ask a question about it. But people who are walking around with injuries from emotional trauma or other traumas that they've experienced that really mainly affect their brain, you might not be as readily to ask about that, because that scar, that the impact of whatever it is that gave them that scar is invisible. It's hidden inside the person's skull, so you can't see it.
So, as a neurologist, can you physically see that? Does that make one's brain look different? Or when you say, to the layperson who reads your piece that says, as a matter of fact, these invisible scars are impacting brain development, what does that look like from if you were to look at the brain, or what do you mean by that in terms of like how is that impacting or changing our children's brain?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not the kind of injury that if you did, like, let's say an MRI or a CAT scan of their brain, it wouldn't be obvious. You're not going to see an actual a piece of trauma there. But we're talking about the function of the brain, how the brain actually works. So usually the way I put it is, if you look at a house and you might see that the structure of the house looks good, but the wiring is off. So the electricity might not work properly, or the internet connection might not work properly. So it's really the functioning aspect where the problem is. And so obviously, if that function is off, the person is just not necessarily the same, and they could be very significantly impacted by that injury to their brain.
Yeah, and so what are the short-term implications of this? And then what are the long-term? So if it's changing childhood development, if a traumatic incident changes the way someone's brain is developing, do you think of that in terms of a short-term impact, or is that going to change the trajectory of the way their brain functions for the rest of their life?
Yeah, one of the problems is a lot of times the short-term effects aren't that obvious because the person themselves might not be aware that they actually have the scar. So it's invisible even to the individual. And so they might not actually seek help. And so now you're walking around. So imagine it that you've got this injury, you're ignoring it, the world is ignoring it, and you're living through life with it. And now another injury happens. Now you've got compound on that injury. And so until you get to, let's say, a breaking point where you've had multiple of these, or it could be the original one that compounds, and now when they're 14, 15, and they're acting out behavior, they're depressed, they're anxious, all these things, and the parent says, where did this come from? I don't know where this came from. And you don't realize that it's really been something that's been happening throughout their upbringing, that they've had these changes in their brain's development.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you brought up anxiety and depression, because I'm going to be honest, that's actually what really caught my attention when I read your piece. Because I think that if you're a parent in the United States right now, or if you're an educator or a medical provider who thinks about children and adolescents, many of us are deeply concerned by the fact that there's this trend or pandemic of childhood and teenage anxiety and depression. I think that, in terms of the studies I've seen, that's the case. But just anecdotally, as a parent and a mom, I know that it seems like now it's the norm to have children who deal with really deep levels of anxiety. And so I do want to talk to you about that. When you talk about trauma, is it one single traumatic incident, or is sustained anxiety just from the way society works now also included in that? So do you think about one specific traumatic abuse or a death or something like that, or can it just be this pandemic of anxiety that also impacts brain development?
Yeah, so it's both. It could be a single event. Let's say we know a lot of young women and even young boys might, let's say, suffer a sexual trauma. That one incident is so dramatic and so harmful that it could just be that. But then you also it could be somebody, let's say you're growing up in a low-income household where you're in a neighborhood with a lot of crime, where you're worried about getting shot, you're hearing gunshots at night. So cumulative trauma could also be a factor, having food insecurity, not knowing where your next meal is coming from. I was recently actually at a Board of Education meeting where they say we're going to shut down these schools. You shut down the school, that in itself could be a traumatic experience for that child, because now you're abruptly moving them from one place to another, and you say, oh, well, the child is resilient, we can just do that. No, it's not so simple. All these little things that are happening to these children can accumulate, and even if they're not talking about it, it can have really detrimental impacts on them, and they might be afraid to talk about it. They might not tell you that this thing happened and it's affecting me, because they might not have the vocabulary and the words to actually express themselves, how this is affecting them. And what's interesting is when people do suffer trauma, oftentimes because that we have this fight or flight response that gets accentuated when you're dealing with traumatic experiences, and that fight or flight response often makes it harder for you to actually communicate. So that's really important. That's why we want to talk about being trauma informed as you deal with, whether it's dealing with patients, dealing with friends, dealing with different people, that they are accumulating these traumas throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, so I want to talk to you about, you and I share something, and that we both think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You think about it, of course, in respect to New York Medical College, how to bring in more diverse students, and to make sure that your field is more diverse so that you can better serve diverse populations. I think about DEI in terms of my industry, which is news, and specifically business news. But because of that, I think one place that we overlap is that we think about inequities. And so when I think about this, I heard you talk about how stress sometimes can become a compounding effect because of worry about violence, or your school closing, or food insecurity. I also know that from my research and from talking to many experts like yourself, that there's inequity in terms of psychological care for economically disadvantaged children. So those two things together sort of bring up a concern, which is, how do we address the fact that those are like two inequities coming together at once, like that I read in your piece, that economically disadvantaged children are at more risk for these invisible wounds. What do you think? Like, how do you think about the solution, how we should be thinking about this, and how we should be trying to make sure there's more equity and less Black and brown and diverse children walking around with invisible scars?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question. And really, as you said that, it made me think about these invisible wounds happening to these children's brains in this invisible population. This population that's often forgotten, these Black and brown children, and children in general are often forgotten. When you look at medications to treat psychosis and agitation, a lot of times these Black and brown children and children from the lower socioeconomic status are disproportionately being given these medications to control their behavior, when we know that talking to them also works. A psychotherapist, bring a psychotherapist into the community, so that they can not be taking these medications that we know are going to increase their likelihood of getting obesity, diabetes, and all these risk factors, things that we know are going to overall worsen their health outcomes in the long run. So we know that they're getting overprescribed these medications when really they just need love. Spend time hugging them, spend time making sure they're eating a good, healthy diet, give them a safe space, so they can actually live and be children. Let them have time to play. Increase. We know there's a lot of underserved communities. You got to look really hard to find a park. Where do you expect them to play? So you want to really increase that green space so that they can have really that access to really grow up as vibrant people who can participate in society and not have to have all these disparities and inequities.
Yeah. So, you have right now the opportunity to talk to some wealth holders in our audience and some business leaders, some city leaders and government officials who could help address this. What would you suggest? What is the best way that we can start to really think about this? Either I'm going to give you full parameter to answer that however you want. If you want to talk about like the quick and easy thing that can be done right now, or if you want to talk about that longer term, slower burn, what do you suggest that we can do to make sure that we are being more aware, more supportive of the children in our society who have these invisible wounds or scars, and specifically those who are economically disadvantaged?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I prefer long-term solutions than the short-term things. And I say one is community partnerships. We want to have, knock down those structural barriers, identify what is it that's standing in the way of me having good health and good education, et cetera. So partnering with those leaders in the communities who know those communities best. Before you close a school, talk to the parents, talk to the children, get an understanding of that community and what they actually really, really need. Look at the things that are worsening our health. Is there a disproportionate amount of what we call food swamps, where you've got tons of unhealthy foods in a community where that's all they have access to? That's causing harm to those communities. So you want to have healthy food options in those communities, spending money on getting teachers and not closing schools, but opening good schools that can actually educate these folks. We know the more educated a community is, a population is, the better overall they're going to do in terms of their health, in terms of their wealth, and in terms of all the things that actually make our society thrive. So those are the most important interventions, but really that community partnership to me is number one.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that one of the kinds of journalism we do here is community editorial communities. One of our communities is Forbes BLK. I actually have the opportunity to talk about mental health and wellness at our summit, and I am definitely going to take a lot of these pieces of information that you have shared, especially about that partnership, community partnerships, to that summit. So I want to say we're out of time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to us about this really important issue, and keep writing those pieces for us so you can continue to make us smarter about this.
Thank you for having me.